Well, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Lance Fieser. Well, this week, voters in Wisconsin will pick their next state Supreme Court justice. It's a race that's become the most expensive state court race in U.S. history. In the running are Janet Protasiewicz, a Milwaukee County judge backed by liberals, and former state Supreme Court Justice Daniel Kelly, who is supported by conservatives. It's a pivotal race that will determine which side has the majority on the court when justices could take up critical issues like abortion access, redistricting, and election laws. That's why so much money has been poured into this race from the candidates and from outside groups. A review by WizPolitics.com shows that spending topped $45 million. That's about 3 times the previous record. That includes more than $24 million spent by Protasiewicz and groups backing her. The spending by Kelly and his supporters is up over $19 million. Both figures do include spending by groups opposing Jennifer Dorow in the primary. Prior to this, the most expensive state Supreme Court race had been about $15 million in Illinois in 2004. Joining us now to talk about the Supreme Court race is Professor Barry Burden from UW-Madison. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
Well, let's start by talking money. Can you put into perspective just what we have seen here and how rare it is to have this much fundraising for a Supreme Court campaign?
Yeah, we don't yet know what the final total will be, but it looks like it's well north of $30 million, could be more than $40 million spent between the candidates and the outside groups. You know, in terms of putting that in perspective, the most expensive Supreme Court race in Wisconsin history was $10 million between the groups and the candidates together. So we're at 3 or 4 times that amount. The most expensive Supreme Court race in any state ever was in Illinois. That was around $15 million. So we're double or triple that. It's just an astronomical amount of spending for a single nonpartisan seat. It's as much as you would see in a governor's election in many states.
Well, Janet Protasiewicz and her camp have made a strong push throughout this to make this election, in large part, about abortion. We saw that in last year's election cycle with Democrats as well. How impactful was that approach?
Oh, I think it's been very effective for the Democrats. It's helped keep them competitive. In 2022, that was an election cycle that was really advantageous for Republicans. They had some national tailwinds that were helping them out. And despite that, Ron Johnson narrowly hung on to his seat. That was the closest of his elections. And Tony Evers managed to win by several percentage points, so a kind of comfortable win for him. And I think in both races, abortion was a factor. It has been a real motivator to get out not just Democratic and progressive voters, but also some independents, probably more women voters than typical because they are concerned about the end of abortion access in Wisconsin following the Dobbs decision last summer.
Based on how lawmakers have both really dug in their heels on both sides of this issue on abortion, how likely is it that the Supreme Court is going to decide the fate of the current abortion ban?
Well, I think it's really going to be a black and white decision from the state Supreme Court when that case gets to them. Abortion services had been available in Wisconsin until last year. Now they're not available. It's on or off, and I think the court will be, in the end, the ultimate arbiter of what the law says and whether the 1849 restrictions can stay in place. Both Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature have floated bills to provide a kind of middle ground with some exceptions, but still limitations. I don't think either one of those efforts was really serious. It was not going to go anywhere given the massive divisions between Governor Evers and Republicans in the legislature. So for the moment, it will be the court that makes the final call.
Well, Daniel Kelly has responded primarily by labeling Protasiewicz as soft on crime. Has that been an effective countermeasure in the past elections that we've seen in the state, particularly you mentioned a few months ago?
Yeah, it is a typical theme that would come up in lots of judicial elections in Wisconsin, including Supreme Court races. Many people in the public associate courts with criminal enforcement, and they have really, kind of visceral concerns about violent crime in particular, things like thefts and assaults and murders. The state Supreme Court doesn't have a lot to do with those kinds of issues. They're dealing with a wider variety of things than those everyday kind of criminal charges. But I think Republicans are hoping they can get some traction out of that issue and connect it to the bail reform efforts they've been pushing in the legislature and will be on the ballot alongside the Supreme Court race.
Janet Protasiewicz has also brought up districting maps as one of the big issues here in this race. What types of impacts could we see if the legality of some of these maps are challenged at the Supreme Court level after this race?
Well, this has been an issue that's been battled back and forth and litigated for at least the last 12 years since the previous round of maps was enacted in 2011. Democrats have been unhappy, increasingly upset about the maps that are in place that they feel have rigged the system in favor of Republicans. And they've sort of pursued all the legal remedies they could in federal court and in state court. And this now gives them one more possible path. If Protasiewicz is successful, that would create a liberal majority bloc on the court. And there are liberal groups ready to bring a new case to relitigate, especially the maps in the Assembly and the state Senate, in hopes that they might get another chance at redrawing those districts and then maybe a chance to win back control of the state legislature at some point.
The spring elections like this are not usually heavily attended. What is the historic norm here, and do you expect it to be different based on just how big this Supreme Court race has become?
Yeah, turnout in a Supreme Court race when there's not a presidential primary on the ballot at the same time is typically 15 to 20, maybe 25% of registered voters. Even a smaller percentage, if you think of that as all of the eligible voters, including those who are not yet registered. We're likely to beat that. The February primary that settled on these two candidates set a record for the highest turnout in a February primary election. April elections normally have turnout 2 to 3 times what we would see in February, so it's likely to be quite high. Now, not at the level of a presidential election, not even probably at the level of the Senate race and the governor's race that we saw in November, but for a nonpartisan contest without a lot else on the ballot that's meaningful for voters, especially at the statewide level, this will be a relatively high level of voter participation.
You mentioned this is a nonpartisan race that is in name only. Have we seen a metamorphosis of these judicial races become more and more partisan over the past decades?
We have. This is sort of the culmination of a trend that's taken place over about the last 10 to 15 years in Wisconsin. It's been a real tendency for ideological groups, advocacy groups to get involved in these races. Unions and business groups have been involved for years, spending money on behalf of candidates, running ads for them or against their opponents. But now we've got the political parties, the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, the Republican Party of Wisconsin, and some of their big donors getting right into the campaigns themselves, donating to the candidates directly, providing services, office space, doing phone banking for the candidates. And the candidates have not been shy about their connections to those parties. So although the party labels won't be on the ballot, it's not hard for the average voter to figure out which side these candidates fall on and what they're likely to do when they get to the court in terms of their rulings.
I want to get your thought on one other thing. The 8th district seat is also up for grabs this coming week. Explain how that outcome could shape state politics as well.
Yeah, this is to fill a vacancy in the 8th district where Alberta Darling has stepped down and created an opening. There's what looks like a competitive race in a Republican-leaning district. So I think the Republican candidate, Dan Knodel, would be favored. If he wins, he would become the 22nd Republican in the state Senate. That would give Republicans a 2/3 majority. That 2/3 majority is important because that gives them the power to impeach public officials, to remove them from office. Those could be judges or other public officials. And Knodel, for his part at least, says he's interested in exploring that power and focusing on judges in particular. So even though the governor and the state legislature are at loggerheads about most policies, this is one that the state Senate could do on its own without involving Governor Evers at all.
And Knodel did mention Janet Protasiewicz as one of the people he would look into, correct?
He did. So these two races are connected in a bunch of ways. Abortion has been an issue in both the Supreme Court race and in the state Senate special election. They're common carriers in terms of campaign activists and others who are trying to push both races. Turnout in one of those races could affect what happens in the other. And now we've got a candidate in the state Senate race saying he's thinking about one of the Supreme Court candidates as a target of possible impeachment. So he's not been shy about that.
Barry Burton, thank you so much for the time here this week.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.